The dust swirled around the desolate mining colony of Vorlax 3, its once bustling streets now silent and abandoned. Darius Vex, a seasoned ex-marine turned scavenger, trudged through the barren wasteland, his boots crunching against the cracked, dried soil. His rough hands gripped his blaster, scanning the area for anything useful. The colony, once home to thousands of miners, was now a forgotten relic, left to decay after the mineral veins ran dry and the inhabitants abandoned it. Darius had spent years picking through the wreckage of abandoned settlements, searching for valuable technology or anything that could fetch a decent price. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. As he wandered deeper into the abandoned sector, a strange sound caught his attention. Soft, faint, like a whisper on the wind. His instincts kicked in, and he silently crouched behind a broken-down mining rig, listening. The sound was followed by a faint groan. Narrowing his eyes, Darius pushed through the tall weeds that had overtaken the area and made his way toward the source. There, in the dim light of the dying sun, he saw something, or rather, someone, lying motionless among the rubble. It was a figure, barely visible beneath a pile of metal debris. Cautiously, Darius approached, his heart rate picking up. As he neared, he saw the glimmer of bioluminescence, like faint blue streaks of light running across the figure's body. It wasn't human. He'd seen enough alien species in his time to recognize the markings of a Nixari, a race so mysterious that few had ever even encountered one. This alien girl, though, wasn't just a Nixari. She was hurt, badly. Darius knelt beside her, feeling a flicker of unease. Her skin, a shimmering mix of deep purple and blue, was flickering like a dying star. She was barely conscious, her breaths shallow and ragged. His eyes scanned for the cause of her distress, a gash across her side, deep and oozing with a strange, glowing substance. The Nixari weren't known for their vulnerability, and seeing one in such a fragile state was both surprising and alarming. Without a second thought, Darius made a snap decision. He couldn't just leave her to die. His old marine training kicked in, and he carefully hoisted the girl into his arms, cradling her against his chest. Her small frame felt unnervingly light, but her pain was palpable. As he carried her through the wreckage, he heard something else. Distant growls, low and menacing. The Skarn beasts. They were predators, vicious and relentless, and they were closing in on the scent of blood. Darius's heart pounded, but there was no time to think. Holding the Nixari girl tightly, Darius sprinted toward his ship, the only safe place in this forsaken colony. The growls grew louder, and soon the sound of snapping jaws and heavy footfalls filled the air. He could hear the beasts gaining on him. In a desperate move, Darius dove behind a nearby cargo crate, narrowly avoiding a massive Skarn beast's jaws as it lunged. He shoved the girl into the ship's cargo hold and scrambled up to the cockpit. As he sealed the hatch, a chill ran through him. The Skarn beasts had surrounded the ship, their eyes glowing red in the fading light. Darius gripped the controls, his fingers flying over the buttons. With a roar of the engines, the ship's thrusters kicked to life. The Skarns pounced, but it was too late. Darius had already blasted off into the sky, the beast's howls fading into the distance as the ship ascended into the void. He exhaled deeply, wiping the sweat from his brow. Looking down at the unconscious Nixari girl beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change everything. He didn't know who she was or why she was here, but one thing was certain. He'd just made an enemy of the Skarn beasts, and worse, he had no idea what other dangers lay ahead. But for now, all he could do was try to keep her alive. The future, it seemed, had just become a lot more complicated. The ship coasted through the stars, its engines humming softly as it sped through the empty void of space. Darius sat in the cockpit, his fingers still tight around the control yoke. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. He had saved a Nixari, a species that humans barely understood. And now he was on the run, with an alien girl who seemed to have nowhere else to go. But she was different from any other alien he'd encountered. Most species, when faced with a debt of gratitude, would offer a quick thank you and go their separate ways. But this girl, the one who was now lying unconscious in the medical bay, didn't seem ready to leave him alone. Darius glanced over at the small monitor that displayed her vitals. Her breathing had steadied, and her pulse was stronger than before. She was healing faster than any human ever could, and that only raised more questions. Who was she really? What was her story? He leaned back in his seat and let out a frustrated sigh. It wasn't like he had time to babysit an alien. He had a reputation to protect, even if it was a small one. He was a scavenger, a loner, someone who made his living off the scraps of a war-torn galaxy. His only concern was himself, and maybe, just maybe, a few credits to keep his ship running. The last thing he needed was to be stuck with a strange girl who didn't seem to understand the concept of personal space. The silence in the cockpit was broken by a soft noise coming from behind him. Darius turned his head just in time to see the Nixari girl stir. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing pools of glowing blue that seemed to pulse with an inner light. She blinked once, twice, before focusing on Darius. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the situation seemed to hang in the air between them. "Where am I?" Her voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable strength beneath it. Her words were laced with a curious, almost musical tone that Darius couldn't place. "You're on my ship," Darius replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "You're safe. For now." She looked around the small cabin, her gaze falling on the ship's controls, the scattered tools, and the empty food containers strewn about. "I see," she murmured, as if she were processing everything at once. "Why? Why did you help me?" Darius shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't really have an answer for that. There was something about her, about the way she carried herself, that had triggered a feeling deep inside him. It wasn't something he'd had in a long time, the desire to protect. He'd learned to trust no one, especially not anyone from another species. And yet, here he was, sitting in a small cockpit with a girl who had no business being here. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice gruff. "Maybe I just couldn't leave you to die. You looked like you needed help." She stared at him for a long moment, her glowing eyes studying him as if she could see straight through to his soul. "You saved me. My life belongs to you now." Darius chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "It's not like that. I didn't do it for any kind of reward, just trying to survive like everyone else." But the Nixari girl didn't seem to understand. She shifted closer to him, her movements graceful, almost otherworldly. "My people, we don't forget such acts. You are now my protector, my Skateri." Darius blinked, confused. "Skateri?" he asked, repeating the strange word. "It is a bond," she explained. "A life debt. I owe you everything now. I can never leave your side." Darius stared at her in disbelief. "Wait, you mean you're just going to follow me around forever?" She nodded, her expression serious. "It is my duty. It is the way of my people." A silence stretched between them, and Darius was left speechless. He had known alien species to be strange and complicated, but this was something entirely new. His mind raced with the implications of what she had just said. She wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. Unless he could figure out a way to get rid of her. Though something told him that wasn't going to happen. "I'm not some guardian," Darius muttered, turning back to the controls. "You're free to go whenever you want." But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Alara wasn't going to leave, and whether he liked it or not, they were in this together now. As the stars stretched out before them, Darius couldn't help but wonder what he had just gotten himself into. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was closing in. Ever since he'd taken off from Vorlax 3 with the Nixari girl, whose name was now Alara, the uneasy silence between them had been shattered by the constant hum of the ship's engines. He tried to focus on the course, set the navigation system to random routes in an attempt to throw anyone off his trail. But the nagging sense of danger never left his mind. Elara spent most of her time quietly observing him, her glowing eyes fixed on the control panels, taking in every movement he made. She didn't talk much, but the bond between them, this Scateri thing, was starting to feel heavier with each passing minute. At first, Darius had hoped that she might change her mind and decide to return to her people. But as the days passed, it became clear she wasn't going anywhere. And neither was he. They were stuck together, whether he liked it or not. As they drifted further into the vast emptiness of space, the nagging feeling in Darius' gut only grew. He had no destination, no real plan beyond survival, and yet something was calling him. Something had changed. It wasn't just about the girl anymore. His life had become tangled with hers in ways he didn't understand. It was early in the morning, if there even was such a thing in deep space, when the warning light blinked on the console. Darius' eyes snapped to it, a sudden rush of adrenaline flooding his system. His finger hovered over the button, and for a moment he wondered if he should just ignore it. But he knew better. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. "Talk to me, Blue," Darius muttered to the ship's eye. The soft, mechanical voice of Swain-8 filled the cabin. "Hostile ship detected, Captain Vex. Incoming at high speed. Trajectory indicates pursuit," Swain-8 reported, its tone as calm as ever, though the urgency was undeniable. Darius cursed under his breath. Great, just what I needed. He quickly scanned the radar. The incoming ship wasn't small. No, this was a warship, sleek and black, designed for speed and intimidation. It was unmistakable. Craven Drell. The name alone sent a cold shiver down his spine. Craven Drell was the leader of the Crimson Syndicate, a ruthless mercenary faction that controlled a vast network of pirates and bounty hunters. Darius had crossed paths with Drell once before, and he didn't want to again. Not under these circumstances. He could already hear Drell's voice in his mind, smooth and taunting, promising pain and suffering for anyone who dared defy him. But Darius wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of much anymore. But Elara, she was another story. She was the one they were after. She was the reason Craven was hunting them. And if they didn't move fast, they'd be dead before they knew it. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Darius barked, his hands flying across the control panels. The ship lurched as he slammed the throttle forward, sending them into a sharp turn that rattled the hull. Elara gripped the edge of the nearest seat, her glowing eyes wide, but she didn't say anything. She trusted him. Scene-8's voice chimed in. "Craven's ship is locked onto us, Captain. It's too fast. We won't outrun it in open space." Darius cursed again, his mind racing. "What about weapons? You got anything that can give us a fighting chance?" There was a brief silence before Swain-8 responded. "Not good enough." Darius cut off the AI. "Can we hide? Anything on the radar I can use to lose him?" "Negative. You're the only ship in range, Captain. He's closing in." Darius slammed his fist onto the dashboard, frustration boiling over. He could feel the weight of Elara's presence behind him, her eyes locked on him with a quiet intensity. She knew the danger they were in, but she wasn't afraid. If anything, she was calm, as if she had been in this kind of situation before. Elara stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the screen. "I can help," she said, her voice steady, almost too calm. Darius turned to her, startled. "What do you mean, help?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "We need to outrun them, not get caught in some kind of trap." "I'm not talking about running," Elara replied, her glowing blue eyes meeting his. "I can manipulate energy fields. I can create an electromagnetic pulse, if you're willing to risk it." Darius raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me you can stop that ship with some kind of energy trick? You're out of your mind." But as the enemy ship got closer, Darius knew he had no choice. He didn't trust her fully yet, But right now, he didn't have a better option. "Do it," he said, his voice gruff. "We either survive together, or we don't survive at all." With a determined nod, Alara moved toward the console, her hands glowing faintly as she began to focus. A ship's hum grew louder, the air crackling with energy. And for the first time in a long while, Darius felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape this. The tension in the cockpit was thick, almost tangible, as Darius gripped the control yoke, his eyes darting between the radar and Alara, who stood silently beside him. The warship, Craven Drells, was now so close that Darius could almost feel the heat of its weapons charging. Alara's words echoed in his mind. She could help, but could he trust her? She wasn't just any alien. She was Nixari, a species with abilities Darius could barely begin to comprehend. As he glanced at her, he saw the quiet resolve in her eyes, her glowing blue pupils focused on something only she could sense. "Are you sure you can do this?" Darius asked, his voice laced with doubt. His fingers hovered over the manual controls, ready to take action if things went south. Alara didn't flinch. "I am certain," she replied softly, her voice calm despite the danger. "But it is a risk." Darius didn't like risks. Not with his life, not with hers. But right now, risks were all he had. He could either trust her or watch as the Crimson Syndicate took them both. He took a deep breath, giving her a tight nod. "Then, let's do it." Without another word, Alara moved toward the center of the cabin. She extended her hands, palms up, as if reaching for something invisible. Her bioluminescent skin flickered and pulsed with a soft glow, the air around her seemingly vibrating. Darius watched, entranced, as her eyes closed, her focus narrowing to a single point. The energy in the room seemed to shift, and for a moment, the ship's hum became louder, charged with something he couldn't explain. Scene 8's voice broke the silence. "Captain, Craven's ship is just moments away from firing. We need to make a decision now." Darius turned to the eye, frustration creeping into his voice. "You don't think I know that?" Alara's voice was almost a whisper as she continued her concentration. "Hold on. It's starting." Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered, and the entire craft seemed to shudder under the strain of the electromagnetic field building within it. Darius braced himself, his hands tight on the controls, ready for whatever was about to happen. The radar blinked red, warning him that Craven's ship had locked onto their position. Then, in a flash of blue light, a pulse shot outward from Alara's body. The ship shuddered again, more violently this time, and Darius heard the whirring of the controls as they were thrown into chaos. Everything inside the ship sparked and flickered as the energy field Alara created clashed with the enemy's targeting systems. But something else was happening too. The pulse wasn't just blocking their weapons. It was sending a signal, something Darius hadn't expected. Alara's head jerked back, her hands lowering slightly, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and something darker. "It's not just the ship. It's me," she said, her voice strained. "I didn't realize." Before Darius could ask what she meant, a surge of memories flooded Alara's mind. Flashes of her past, images of her people, the Nixari, the peaceful and mysterious race who had once roamed the galaxy freely. But now, the Nixari were in hiding, their cities lost to time, their powers sealed away for fear of destruction. The pulse that had just been unleashed wasn't just an attack. It was a signal, a beacon, and it was calling something far older and far more powerful than anything Darius had ever encountered. Alara staggered back, her eyes flickering with confusion and pain. "I didn't mean to send that signal. I didn't realize the artifact I carry. It's alive." Darius frowned, his pulse quickening. "What are you talking about? What artifact?" Alara swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just some Nixari relic. It's a key to something that shouldn't be disturbed. I didn't realize how far its reach was until now. The signal. It's calling them." Darius' mind raced. Who is it calling? Alara's eyes shifted to the console, where the radar blinked ominously. In that moment, Darius knew the danger had escalated. They weren't just running from Craven anymore. They were about to be caught in something much larger than any bounty hunter or mercenary gang. They were about to unleash something ancient. And now, there was no turning back. Before he could process everything, Alara spoke again, her voice filled with an eerie calm. We need to leave this sector. Immediately. Whatever is coming, it won't stop until it finds me. Darius clenched his fists, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew they had no choice but to run. As he powered up the ship's engines, he couldn't help but feel that they had just crossed a line that, once crossed, would change everything. There was no going back now. The hunt was on, and they had just drawn the attention of forces they couldn't even begin to understand. The stars outside the cockpit seemed to blur as Darius pushed the ship's engines to their limits. The pulsating hum of the craft's thrusters filled the cabin, and the acceleration pressed him back into his seat. His knuckles were white as he gripped the controls, eyes darting from the radar to the rapidly approaching wall of empty space. They had to get out of this sector. Now, behind him, Alara was still recovering from the intense burst of energy she had released. She was sitting still, her hands resting lightly on her lap, but her mind seemed to be a world away, lost in the gravity of what had just happened. The shock of the energy pulse had worn off, but the weight of her revelation lingered in the air between them. We've got a problem, Darius muttered, glancing at the radar. The small blip that had been Craven's ship was now joined by another, and another after that. The Crimson Syndicate wasn't the only thing after them. There were other ships now, drawn to the pulse. Ships that were fast and deadly. We need to move faster, Darius said, his voice tight. He flicked a switch, activating the ship's cloaking device. The hull of the ship shimmered for a moment before becoming nearly invisible to the naked eye. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Can you tell me what the hell just happened, Alara? Why did that pulse do all that? Alara looked up, her eyes clouded with confusion. I don't fully understand it myself. The artifact I carry, it's not just an object. It's a relic from my people's past, something we've kept hidden for centuries. It has powers, ancient powers, and She paused, her voice faltering. I didn't mean to trigger it. I didn't know it would reach out like that. Darius' mind was racing. What does this artifact do, exactly? What's it calling? I can't say for certain, Alara replied, her voice distant. But it's a key to something older than my people, older than the galaxy itself. Something dangerous. And now that the signal has been sent, I fear the hunt has begun. Darius didn't like the sound of that. The last thing he needed was to be involved in some ancient alien war or cosmic conspiracy. He was a scavenger, not a hero. He wasn't built for this kind of trouble. But it was too late now. There was no going back. Scene 8's voice suddenly broke through the tension. Captain Vex, multiple ships are closing in. They've picked up on the pulse. You're not alone anymore. Darius swore under his breath. How many? At least 5 ships, Captain, Solane 8 replied. 2 of them are warships, heavily armed. They appear to be part of the Relic Seekers, an ancient faction known for collecting powerful artifacts. The rest are bounty hunters, likely hired by Craven Drell. They're all converging on your location. Darius' mind spun. The Relic Seekers. He had heard of them. An organization that had been rumored to be hunting down powerful alien relics for centuries. If they were after Alara's artifact, things were worse than he thought. They weren't just running from pirates anymore. They were running from forces that had the power to reshape the galaxy. Where can we go? Darius asked, his voice tight. We're not going to outrun them. There's nowhere left to hide. Actually, there is one place, Alara said suddenly, her voice sharp with determination. She looked at him, her expression intense. I know of a hidden station, A neutral ground where neither the Syndicate nor the Relic Seekers can reach us. It's deep in the Valorian Nebula. If we can get there, we might have a chance to regroup. The Valorian Nebula. Darius had heard stories about it. An uncharted area of space, filled with thick clouds of gas and hidden dangers. But if Alara was right, it was their only shot. He didn't like it, but it was better than being surrounded by enemies on all sides. Set the course, Darius ordered. We're going to the Valorian Nebula. Alara nodded, moving quickly to the navigational console. Her fingers danced over the controls as she input the coordinates. The ship's engines roared in response, shifting their trajectory toward the nebula. Darius exhaled slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The chase was on. The enemy ships were closing in, and they were running out of time. His grip tightened on the control yoke as he adjusted their speed, pushing the ship to its limits. But as they hurtled toward the unknown, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that they were running headfirst into something far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The galaxy was full of enemies, but it was also full of secrets, and he had a sinking feeling that Alara's artifact was about to reveal a whole new level of danger. The ship tore through the vast emptiness of space, its engines roaring as Darius pushed it to its absolute limits. The Valorian Nebula loomed ahead, a swirling mass of gases and cosmic dust, shimmering in hues of purple and blue. Darius could feel the ship's hull groaning under the strain, but there was no turning back now. He glanced at the console. 5 enemy ships, still following them, still closing in. They were relentless, and the pressure was mounting. Behind him, Alara was eerily silent, her eyes fixed on the display screen. She hadn't said much since they'd set course for the nebula. It was as if the weight of their situation was settling deeper into her mind. Darius didn't blame her. They were racing toward the unknown, and with each passing second, their enemies were getting closer. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Darius asked, his voice strained. The fear of being trapped in the nebula gnawed at him. It was a dangerous place, filled with gravitational anomalies, ion storms, and hidden debris. It wasn't exactly the perfect refuge when you were being hunted. Alara finally looked up, her expression solemn. "It's the only place I know where we can lose them. If we get deep enough into the nebula, the interference will scramble their sensors, but we can't stay long. The nebula is too unstable, and there's no guarantee we'll make it out in one piece." Darius' jaw tightened. He didn't have a choice. They had to make it work. "Just make sure we don't end up as stardust." "Okay." Alara nodded, but her eyes still held the same haunted look. She knew something that Darius didn't, and the uncertainty of it made him uneasy. There was too much at stake now, more than just survival. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a race to something bigger, something far more dangerous. The ship entered the nebula with a violent jolt, the swirling mass of gas and dust enveloping them, making the outside world vanish into a kaleidoscope of colors. The stars were blotted out, replaced by an eerie glow that flickered in the fog. The radar went wild as the ship entered the gravitational fields of the nebula, making it harder to track their pursuers. Scene 8's voice crackled through the intercom. "Captain Vex, the enemy ships are not far behind. They're adjusting their course to match the nebula's trajectory." Darius cursed under his breath, eyes darting from one console to another. The cloaking device was still active, but it wasn't enough to guarantee their safety. The enemy ships had already adapted to their movements once. There was no telling how long it would take before they found a way through the nebula's interference. "We need a plan, and we need it fast," Darius muttered, glancing over at Alara. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the swirling nebula outside the viewport. Then she spoke in a low voice. "There's a station nearby. It's abandoned, old, and forgotten by most. But if we can make it there, we might be able to hide long enough to slip past them." Darius raised an eyebrow. "You're saying there's a secret station in here, and we're just supposed to stumble upon it in this mess?" Alara's expression didn't waver. "It's not far. I can guide you. Darius didn't hesitate. If there was even a chance of finding shelter in this nebula, he had to take it. Fine. Lead the way. Alara quickly began working at the controls, her fingers flying over the console. Darius kept his eyes on the radar, watching the enemy ships slowly close in. Hold on, Darius growled, slamming the throttle forward. The ship jerked violently as it lurched forward at high speed, darting between clumps of cosmic debris and rocky formations. The nebula, once beautiful and serene, now seemed like an obstacle course designed to tear them apart. Alara's voice cut through the chaos. We're almost there, just a little farther. But as they continued to race through the nebula, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that they were being herded, as if the nebula itself was closing in on them. The shadows of the enemy ships loomed in the distance, relentless, unyielding. No matter how fast they went, they couldn't outrun the inevitable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the faint outline of an ancient station emerged from the fog of the nebula. It was old, crumbling, and covered in strange markings that Darius couldn't read, but it was a sanctuary. For the moment, at least. Docking in progress, Soane 8 announced, and the ship's engines whined as Darius expertly navigated toward the station's docking bay. They were inside. Safe. For now. Darius exhaled, slumping back in his seat as the ship's engines powered down. But Alara was already standing, her gaze fixed on the abandoned station outside. Her mind was elsewhere again, lost in the weight of the secret she had yet to fully share. Whatever lay ahead, Darius knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The air inside the ancient station was thick with the scent of dust and age. Darius stepped off the ship, his boots making a dull thud as they hit the cold metal floor. The station was dark, the faint glow of distant stars barely cutting through the thick haze that filled the corridors. The walls were cracked and weathered, covered in strange symbols that Darius didn't recognize. It had clearly been abandoned for a long time, but it still held an unsettling energy, as if the very walls had witnessed things better left forgotten. Alara moved ahead of him, her steps light and purposeful. Her eyes seemed to scan the surroundings with an intensity that made Darius uneasy. She had been quiet ever since they arrived, lost in her thoughts, as if she was waiting for something that had yet to reveal itself. Darius didn't push her to speak. He knew better by now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Soane 8, any sign of the enemy ships? Darius asked, his voice low, as if speaking louder might invite danger. No sign yet, Captain Vex, Soane 8 replied, its voice calm and mechanical. However, the ships are still within the nebula. They may be preparing to breach it shortly. Darius didn't need to hear that to know it was true. The clock was ticking. If they didn't find what they needed here, they'd have nowhere left to run. And from the way Alara was acting, Darius had a feeling that whatever they were looking for wasn't just a safe hideout. It was something far more significant. He could see it in her eyes, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out to touch the walls. It was as if she were searching for something that only she could sense. Alara, Darius called, his voice softer now. What are we really looking for here? She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked further into the station, her eyes narrowing as she passed more of the strange symbols. The air around them grew colder as they ventured deeper. The walls seemed to hum with a faint energy, a low vibration that Darius could almost feel in his chest. It was as if the station itself was alive, waiting, listening. We're looking for answers, Alara finally said, her voice steady but distant. She stopped in front of a large, circular door, its surface covered in glowing runes that pulsed softly in the dim light. Her fingers hovered just above the door, as if she were waiting for some unseen signal. This place was once a hub for my people, a place of knowledge and power. But it was abandoned long ago, after the last of the Nixari left this region. No one has set foot here in centuries. Darius crossed his arms, watching her closely. So why did you bring us here? Alara's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Because I need to know what my people left behind. The artifact I carry is a key, Darius. A key to unlocking something, something that could change everything. He felt a shiver run down his spine. The way she spoke about it, the artifact, her people, this place, it was all starting to make sense, but it was also terrifying. He didn't know what was at stake here, but it was clear that Alara did. And whatever was locked behind that door, she was determined to find it. Without another word, Alara stepped forward, placing her hand on the glowing runes. The door hissed and groaned, its metal surface shifting as the symbols flared to life, bathing the hallway in a soft, blue glow. The door slowly began to open, revealing a large chamber beyond. Darius felt his pulse quicken as they entered the room. Inside, the space was vast, filled with ancient technology, dusty terminals, and strange relics that seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't understand. Alara moved deeper into the room, her eyes scanning everything with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was searching for something specific, something that only she could recognize. Darius stayed close behind, his senses on high alert. The station may have been abandoned, but the silence in the air felt oppressive, like it was hiding something. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it, a large crystal pulsated with an eerie light. The crystal was surrounded by intricate car. "That's it," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe and fear. "That's what I've been searching for." Darius' heart pounded in his chest. Whatever that crystal was, it was the key to everything. And as Alara reached out toward it, he couldn't shake the feeling that their discovery here would either save them or seal their doom. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the station, followed by the unmistakable hum of approaching ships. Darius' eyes shot to the entrance of the chamber, his mind racing. They weren't alone anymore. The enemy was here, and they weren't going to let them escape without a fight. Alara's fingers brushed the surface of the crystal, and a blinding light filled the room. The light from the crystal exploded outward, filling the chamber with a blinding glow. Darius shielded his eyes, instinctively stepping back as the room seemed to pulse with power. It wasn't just light. It was energy, raw and uncontained, flooding the air around them. His heart raced, and he could feel the temperature rise, the air thick with static. Alara stood frozen, her hand still hovering above the crystal. Her eyes were wide with shock, and for a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped. The entire station seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The humming in the walls grew louder, a strange, low frequency vibrating through the very floor beneath their feet. Then, without warning, the crystal's glow intensified, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. Darius stumbled slightly, his hand reaching out for support. A metallic clang echoed in the distance, followed by the sound of boots on the cold floor. Someone was coming. The door at the far end of the chamber shuddered, and the silhouette of an approaching figure became clear. "Alara," Darius shouted over the rising noise, his voice tense. "We need to move now." But Alara didn't respond. She was too focused on the crystal, her eyes wide with something Darius couldn't quite place. She was mesmerized, her expression a mix of awe and terror. It was as if she were seeing something he couldn't, something that was calling to her, urging her to remain still. "The relic," Alara whispered, almost to herself. "It's awakening. The artifact is reacting to it." She turned her head slowly, meeting Darius' gaze for the first time since the glow began. "This is what I've been waiting for, what my people left behind." Darius' mind was racing. He had no idea what she was talking about, but there was no time to question her now. The sound of approaching ships grew louder, and the walls seemed to tremble even more violently. A deep, rumbling growl resonated in the distance, as if the station itself were coming alive. "Alara, we're not safe here. We need to go." Darius grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the pedestal, but she resisted, her gaze still fixed on the crystal. "I can't," she said, her voice strained. "I need to see this through. I need to know what it's trying to show me." Darius shook his head, frustration building. "I get it. But we'll all be dead if we don't move." The room was rapidly becoming unstable. The light from the crystal flashed brighter, and suddenly, the entire station seemed to lurch, as though it were alive and fighting against the forces trying to invade it. The door they had entered through slammed open with a deafening crack, and a group of soldiers, dressed in sleek black armor, stormed in. Their weapons were raised, their faces grim. "Stand down," a deep voice commanded. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They aimed their weapons at Darius and Alara, blocking the exit. The soldiers' armor shimmered with the insignia of the Relic Seekers, the very group Darius had feared. "We've been tracking you," Alara, the leader of the group said, his voice cold. "And now we found you. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Darius stepped in front of Alara, his heart pounding. He had no weapons, nothing but his wits, and the few years of experience surviving in hostile space. But he wasn't about to let them take Alara. Not now, not when they were so close to unraveling whatever was hidden here. "You'll have to go through me first," Darius growled, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The leader of the Relic Seekers raised an eyebrow. "You think you can stop us? You're out of your depth, scavenger." But before Darius could respond, the crystal flared once again, releasing a wave of energy that sent everyone stumbling backward. The light filled the room, blinding and overwhelming. For a moment, it felt as though the entire station was shifting, bending reality itself. The Relic Seekers staggered, their weapons faltering in the midst of the blast. Darius shielded his eyes, his mind reeling. What was happening? What had Alara triggered? "It's time," she whispered, her voice steady. "The key has been unlocked. The past is awakening." The ground rumbled again, and suddenly, the very walls of the station seemed to crack, as though something ancient was stirring beneath them. The air around them shimmered with an electric charge as the crystal's light reached a new intensity, and Darius realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about them anymore. Whatever secret the station had been hiding, whatever force had been sealed away for centuries, was now free. The Relic Seekers, stunned by the blast, were beginning to rise again. Their leader's voice rang out, filled with anger and disbelief. "No, you don't understand what you've unleashed," he yelled. But it was too late. The awakening had begun, and there was no turning back now. The crystal pulsed one last time, a surge of energy rippling through the air, as though the very fabric of space was being torn apart. The station groaned, its ancient system struggling to cope with the awakening power. The floor trembled, and the walls shook violently. The Relic Seekers had fallen to the ground once again, their weapons no longer steady in their hands. Darius felt the ground beneath his feet shift, as the room seemed to spin with the raw force of the crystal's energy. Alara stood at the center of it all, unmoving, her eyes locked on the crystal. The light from it bathed her in a strange, almost ethereal glow. Darius had never seen her like this, calm, focused, yet something deeper flickered behind her eyes. She was in tune with the crystal now, connected to it in a way that made Darius feel like an outsider in his own body. He reached for her arm, pulling her away from the pedestal. "Alara, we have to go. We can't control this. It's too much." But Alara didn't respond. Instead, she reached up and touched the crystal again, and the light flared brighter. The air crackled with energy, and the room around them seemed to distort, warping as if the very laws of reality were being bent. Suddenly, everything went quiet. It was a deafening silence, and in that moment, Darius knew something was coming, something far beyond anything he could have imagined. Then it happened. From the crystal, a voice echoed, deep, ancient, and otherworldly. It reverberated through the entire station, shaking the walls and filling Darius' mind with visions of things he couldn't fully comprehend. The voice spoke directly to Alara, calling her by name, and the words it spoke seemed to carry the weight of millennia. Elara, the time has come. The veil between worlds is thinning. You are the key to our return. The sound of the voice seemed to cut through Darius' thoughts, and he staggered back, his chest tightening. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread flood over him. Something was awakening, not just the crystal, but something far older, something more dangerous. Whatever Elara had unlocked, it wasn't just a relic of her people, it was something that could destroy everything. The relic seekers had regained their footing by now. Their leader, still struggling to stand, shot a glance at the glowing crystal, his face a mix of awe and fear. "You fools don't know what you've done," he hissed, struggling to find his balance. "The ancient homes, they're waking, and when they do, nothing will stop them." Darius turned to face the leader of the Seekers, his fists clenched. "Then we'll stop them. We don't have a choice." But Elara remained still, her eyes fixed on the glowing crystal, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The ground beneath them began to tremble again, stronger this time, the vibrations growing in intensity. Darius could feel the station beginning to disintegrate around them, as if it were being consumed by the power emanating from the crystal. The leader of the Seekers seemed to understand the full magnitude of what was happening, and his eyes widened in realization. No one can control them. The ancients will rise, and they will reclaim everything. We're all doomed. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Elara finally spoke, her voice calm, almost serene, as though she were at peace with whatever was happening. "It's not about control," she said softly. "It never was. We are the key to unlocking the past, but we must also face what we've buried." With that, a loud cracking sound echoed through the station, and the walls began to break apart. The ground beneath their feet shifted once more, and the light from the crystal grew blinding. Darius had no idea what Elara meant, but one thing was certain. Whatever was coming, it was unstoppable now. As the energy from the crystal reached its peak, the station seemed to collapse in on itself. Metal groaned, walls cracked, and the very structure began to disintegrate. The relic seekers were frantically trying to escape, but it was too late. The energy had taken hold of the station, and it was already being consumed by the force Elara had unlocked. Darius turned to Elara, desperate. "We have to leave, now." Elara looked at him, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "There's no escaping it now, Darius. We've opened the door. And once the ancients return, the universe will never be the same." As the station continued to fall apart around them, Darius felt his heart racing. There was no running, no turning back. The very fabric of reality was warping, and all he could do was hold on to Elara as the world around them began to unravel. And then, in a burst of light, everything went dark. The station was gone, the crystal's power leaving nothing but silence and echoes in its wake. The ancient ones had returned, and the universe was about to face its reckoning. And Darius, he had no idea if he would survive it.